In the harsh wilderness of Montana Territory, where winter storms can bury a person's dreams as easily as their body, Mara Ellison learned that survival meant expecting nothing from anyone. 8 months pregnant and abandoned by the man who promised her forever, she had made peace with raising her child alone in a one-room cabin, miles from the nearest neighbor. The howling blizzard that swept across the valley that December night seemed like just another test of her resolve. But when she spotted a dark shape collapsed in the snow near a woodpile, everything changed. The half-frozen stranger she dragged inside wasn't just any drifter. He was Weston Hawley, heir to one of Texas's largest cattle empires, wearing silk gloves and fine wool beneath the ice. What would drive a wealthy man's son to nearly die alone in the Montana wilderness?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Mara Ellison had never intended to become the kind of woman who dragged half-dead strangers from snowdrifts. But life had a way of reshaping intentions, like wind carving stone. The cabin her father built 23 years ago had witnessed his death from consumption, her mother's passing in childbirth, and now sheltered her own uncertain future. Its rough-hewn logs bore the scars of hard winters and harder choices, much like the woman who called it home. The stranger lay unconscious on her father's old cot, his breathing shallow and labored. Steam rose from his damp clothes as the fires. Warmth battled the cold embedded in his bones. Mara had stripped away his ice-crusted outer garments, revealing beneath them the kind of fine wool and tailored cotton that spoke of money, real money, not the handful of coins that constituted her life's savings. His hands, now pale as winter birch, had clearly never known calluses or honest work. Those silk gloves she'd peeled away told a story of privilege that seemed as foreign to her as the Chinese tea the traveling merchants sometimes offered. She pressed her father's hand-carved wooden cross between her palms, a habit born of desperate times. The small crucifix, worn smooth by years of worried fingers, had been Papa's most treasured possession aside from his daughter. "Lord knows I've got enough troubles without adding a stranger's burdens," she whispered to the flickering flames. But even as she spoke the words, her hands were already reaching for another blanket to tuck around his shivering form. The blizzard outside had been building for 3 days, transforming her small valley into a white wasteland that stretched unbroken to the distant mountains. This was Montana Territory in December, when survival became a daily negotiation with forces beyond human control. The wind howled like something alive and angry, driving snow against the cabin's single window until the glass rattled in its frame. Inside, the fire crackled and hissed, consuming precious wood that would need to last until spring's thaw made gathering more possible. Mara's daily routine had become a careful dance of conservation and necessity. Each morning, she'd check the stranger's fever, forcing spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips when consciousness briefly surfaced. She'd learned to read the signs of frostbite, massaging his fingers and toes with careful attention, praying that no black marks would appear to signal death creeping through his extremities. Between these nursing duties, she maintained the cabin's warmth, rationed her dwindling food supplies, and tried to ignore the growing weight in her belly that reminded her of approaching motherhood. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing the tension that had settled over their small sanctuary. 8 months along, with perhaps 4 weeks remaining until birth, she faced the terrifying prospect of delivering alone. The nearest neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, lived 6 miles through country that became impassable in weather like this. Dr. Hewitt, in the settlement, was 15 miles away, might as well be 1,500 when snow drifted higher than a horse's belly. Thomas Crawford had promised to stay through the birth, had sworn on his mother's Bible that their child would know its father's name. Those promises had melted away like spring snow when he'd received word that his family's business in Denver required his immediate attention. "I'll send for you once I'm established," he'd said, his eyes already distant with plans that clearly didn't include a pregnant woman and the complications she represented. The $20 he'd left on the table had been intended as comfort, she supposed, but it felt more like payment for services rendered. In the stranger's fevered mutterings, She caught fragments of another world entirely. He spoke of cattle, drives and board meetings, of someone named Eleanor, and of father's expectations. Once, in a moment of particular agitation, he'd gripped her wrist with surprising strength and pleaded, "Tell him I can't marry her. Tell him some things matter more than business." The desperation in his voice had stirred something protective in her chest, a recognition of trapped creatures fighting for freedom. His horse, a fine-boned bay mare with intelligent eyes, had taken shelter in her small barn alongside her 2 goats and the chickens. The animal bore the kind of breeding that suggested careful selection and considerable expense. Even her saddle spoke of quality craftsmanship, though the silver inlay was now tarnished by weather and hard travel. Everything about the strangers. Possessions whispered of wealth, yet here he lay, as helpless as any beggar dot. The fever broke on the 4th day, leaving him weak but lucid. Mara was stirring a pot of thin vegetable soup when she heard him speak. Her name, though, she was certain she'd never told it to him. Turning, she found dark eyes watching her with an intelligence that made her suddenly conscious of her patched dress and work-worn hands. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but carrying the refined accent of education and breeding. "Any decent person would have done the same," she replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The frontier had a way of making decent people choose practical over charitable, survival over sentiment. He struggled to sit up, wincing as his body protested the movement. "I'm Weston Hall, he said, as if the name should mean something to her. When she showed no recognition, something like relief flickered across his features. "From Texas, the Hall Cattle Company." Mara had heard of the big Texas ranches, operations that sprawled across thousands of acres and employed hundreds of men. If he was telling the truth, this man represented more wealth than she'd see in 10 lifetimes. "Long way from home," she observed, ladling soup into a chipped bowl. "Not by choice," he admitted, accepting the soup with hands that trembled slightly. His first spoonful was tentative, but he managed to swallow without difficulty. "I was running from something, someone, a life that wasn't mine to live." The honesty in his confession surprised her. Men of his apparent station usually spoke in careful phrases designed to reveal nothing while seeming to say everything. "Must have been something powerful to drive you this far north in winter," she said, settling into the chair across from him with her own small portion. "An arranged marriage," he said simply, "to a woman I've never loved, for the sake of combining 2 ranch empires. My father believes love is a luxury that men of business can't afford." Mara nearly choked on her soup. The irony was sharp enough. To cut here was a man fleeing a marriage to someone he didn't love, while she carried the child of someone who'd claimed to love her, but couldn't be bothered to stay. "And you disagreed?" "I believe there had to be more to life than doing what was expected, what was profitable." He met her eyes directly. "I still believe that, though I nearly died proving it." Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin, but inside, something had shifted. The stranger Weston was no longer just a burden to be nursed back to health. He was becoming a person with hopes and fears that echoed her own in unexpected ways. Both of them had been abandoned by people who'd claimed to care. Both were facing uncertain futures that required more courage than seemed humanly possible. "The storm should break soon," she said, though she wasn't certain she wanted it to. His presence had filled the cabin with something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The sound of another adult voice, the comfort of shared conversation, the simple reassurance that she wasn't entirely alone in the world. "Yes," he agreed, but his tone suggested he was no more eager for departure than she was for his leaving. "Though I suspect the real storm is just beginning." As if summoned by his words, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly forceful kick to her ribs, making her gasp and press her hand to her side. Weston's eyes immediately dropped to her swollen belly, and she saw the moment when understanding dawned. "How long?" he asked gently. "A month, perhaps less." She met his gaze steadily, daring him to judge her as others had. The father had other obligations. Instead of the disapproval she expected, she saw something like kinship in his expression. "It seems we're both refugees from promises that weren't worth keeping." he said. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind finally began to ease its hold on the valley, Mara lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of another person's breathing. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel like a prison or a last refuge. It felt like home, and that terrified her more than any blizzard ever could. Asterisk, the morning brought deceptive calm, with pale sunlight filtering through the cabins, single window and casting long shadows across the rough planked floor. Weston had slept through the night without fever, and when he woke, his eyes held a clarity that spoke of genuine recovery. But with that clarity came a restlessness that made Mara's stomach tighten with an emotion she didn't want to name. He sat up carefully, testing his strength, and reached into his vest pocket with deliberate purpose. What he withdrew made Mara's breath catch a silver pocket watch of such obvious value that it seemed to glow in the morning light. The case bore an intricate engraving of a longhorn's head surrounded by elaborate scrollwork, and beneath it, the name Halle in flowing script. When he opened it, soft chimes played a melody she didn't recognize, but which spoke of European craftsmanship and generational wealth. "My grandfather's watch," Weston said, noting her stare. "Given to him by his father, who received it from his. 4 generations of Halle men have carried this, each one adding to the family legacy." His thumb traced the engraving with practice. Familiarity, each one bound by it. The weight in his voice told her everything she needed to know about that binding. This wasn't a treasured heirloom. It was a golden chain that had passed from father to son, carrying with it expectations and obligations that had shaped every major decision in his life. "You could sell that and live comfortably for years," she observed, though she doubted he'd ever considered such a possibility. "I could," he agreed. "But then I'd be admitting that 32 years of my life meant nothing, that everything I was raised to value was worthless." He closed the watch with a sharp click. Some days, that doesn't seem like such a terrible admission. His honesty was becoming a habit that made her uncomfortable. Men in her experience didn't reveal their doubts so readily, didn't admit to questioning the foundations of their existence. Thomas had been all certainty and grand promises, right up until the moment uncertainty drove him away. This man seemed built of questions rather than answers, and that made him both more trustworthy and more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. "Tell me about this arranged marriage," she said, settling into her father's old chair with a cup of bitter chicory coffee. Weston's laugh held no humor. "Eleanor Whitman, 24 years old, educated in Boston, accomplished in all the social graces that wealthy young women are expected to master. Her father owns the largest ranch in eastern Texas, and our marriage would create an empire spanning from the Gulf Coast to the Oklahoma border." He paused, staring into the fire. "She's perfectly lovely, perfectly suitable, and I feel absolutely nothing for her beyond polite friendship. Have you told your father this?" "Repeatedly. He believes love is a luxury that interferes with sound business judgment." Weston's fingers tightened around the watch. "He married my mother for her family's connections and has never pretended otherwise. Their marriage produced heirs and expanded our holdings, which he considers the only measures that matter." Mara found herself thinking of her own parents, who had loved each other with a devotion that survived poverty, isolation, and ultimately death itself. Her father had courted her mother with wildflowers and handwritten poems, had spoken her name like a prayer right up until his final breath. "Some of us aren't built for arrangements," she said quietly. "No," Weston agreed. "Some of us are foolish enough to believe in something more." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden change in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of physical discomfort. When he tried to stand, his legs buckled, and Mara was beside him in an instant, steadying him with hands that had grown strong from frontier life. "You're not ready to travel," she said firmly, though part of her was relieved by his weakness. "Another few days, at least. I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." His protest was weakened by the way he leaned into her support, his body's needs overriding his social conditioning. "It's not about hospitality," she replied, helping him back to the cot. "It's about survival. You leave now, in your condition, and I'll be dragging your frozen corpse back here within the hour." The bluntness of her words seemed to surprise him. as if he'd forgotten that frontier life allowed no room for polite deflection. In his world, she supposed, people spoke in careful euphemisms and diplomatic phrases. Here, truth was as essential as firewood, and considerably more scarce. Besides, she added, busying herself with checking his bandages, the nearest town is 2 days' ride in good weather. These roads won't be passable for at least a week. The relief in his expression was quickly masked, but she'd seen it. Whatever he was running from in Texas, he wasn't eager to face it just yet. The knowledge created an intimacy between them that had nothing to do with the physical care she'd provided. They were both refugees, both buying time before inevitable confrontations with the lives they'd left behind. You mentioned obligations, he said, his gaze settling on her rounded belly. What happened to the father? The question she'd been dreading, though she appreciated his directness. Thomas Crawford, a businessman from Denver, who convinced me that love could overcome practical considerations. She continued her examination of his healing frostbite, not meeting his eyes. Turns out practical considerations have a way of overcoming love when circumstances become inconvenient. He abandoned you? The anger in Weston's voice was immediate and genuine, surprising her with its intensity. He had opportunities in Denver that couldn't wait for a baby's arrival, or so he explained it. The old hurt had dulled to a manageable ache, but talking about it still required careful handling. Left me $20 and promises to send for me once he was established. And you believed him? For about 3 days, she admitted. Then I realized that a man who could walk away from his pregnant fiancée had never intended to keep any promises he'd made. Weston was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the parallels between their situations. Both of them had been betrayed by people who'd claimed to love them. His father by demanding a loveless marriage, her lover by abandoning her when love became complicated. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. I'm sorry, he said simply. No woman should face motherhood alone, and no man should be forced to marry someone he doesn't love, she replied. Though I suppose the world is full of people doing things they never thought they'd have to do. That afternoon, he insisted on helping with the daily chores despite her protests. Watching a man who'd clearly never performed manual labor attempt to split kindling was both amusing and touching. His technique was atrocious, his hands soft and unpracticed, but his determination was unmistakable. Each swing of the axe was a declaration of independence from the life of ease and privilege he'd known. There's no shame in letting others do the work, she said after he'd spent 20 minutes producing what she could have accomplished in 5. There's no honor in it either, he replied, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold air. I've spent 32 years having other people split my wood, tend my horses, even choose my bride. Maybe it's time I learned to do things for myself. The simple statement contained layers of meaning that resonated through the cabin like the echo of an axe blow. This wasn't just about recovering from frostbite or temporary refuge from family expectations. This was about fundamental change, about a man discovering who he might become if freed from the golden chains of inherited obligation. As evening approached, and they shared another simple meal by firelight, Mara found herself studying his face. In the flickering shadows, the fever had stripped away the soft edges of privilege, revealing sharper features that spoke of character rather than comfort. His hands were beginning to show the effects of honest work, small calluses forming where blisters had been. What will you do? She asked. When you're strong enough to leave? I don't know, he admitted. For the first time in my life, I have no plan, no expectations to fulfill, no predetermined path to follow. He met her gaze directly. It's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Outside, the wind had picked up again, reminding them. Both that winter in Montana Territory didn't release its grip easily. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and the growing connection between two people who had found in each other an unexpected understanding, the cold seemed less threatening. They were both running from something, both facing uncertain futures, but for now, they had shelter and companionship, and the flickering hope that tomorrow might offer possibilities neither had dared to imagine. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with its naturalness. Weston's recovery progressed steadily, marked not just by returning strength, but by a growing familiarity with tasks that would have been unthinkable to him a week earlier. His hands, once soft as a child's, began to show the honest marks of labor-small cuts from splitting kindling, calluses from carrying water buckets, burns from tending the fire when Mara needed rest. She discovered his leather-bound journal. Quite by accident, finding it tucked beneath his pillow when she was changing the bedding. The worn cover bore his initials in gold leaf, and the pages she glimpsed were filled with careful script that spoke of education and introspection. When she attempted to tuck it back without reading, he caught her. "It's all right," he said, noting her embarrassment. "There's nothing in there that would shock you. Mostly questions I've been afraid to ask myself out loud." "Questions about what?" "About whether a man can change the fundamental direction of his life at 32. About whether duty to family is worth sacrificing personal happiness. About whether I'm strong enough to build something meaningful in my own hands instead of inheriting it." He paused, watching her face carefully. "About whether a woman like you could ever see value in a man like me." The honesty of that last admission made her chest tighten. She was 8 months pregnant, abandoned, surviving on dwindling supplies in a one-room cabin, yet he spoke as if she were the prize and he the supplicant. The reversal of their circumstances, his wealth meaningless here, her practical skills, essential, had created an equality between them that neither had experienced before. "A woman like me sees value in actions, not ancestry," she replied, settling into her father's chair to fold the baby clothes she'd been sewing from old fabric. "The question is whether you can see value in a life that doesn't come with inherited advantages." Weston studied her for a long moment, noting the careful stitches she placed in tiny garments, the way she made beauty from necessity. "I'm beginning to think inherited advantages might be the problem rather than the solution." That afternoon, she taught him to milk the goats, a task that required patience and gentleness rather than strength. His initial attempts were awkward, the animals sensing his uncertainty and responding with stubborn resistance. But gradually, under her guidance, he learned the rhythm and pressure needed to coax milk from reluctant udders. "Talk to them," Mara instructed, watching him struggle with the more temperamental of the two goats. "Animals respond to voice and manner more than technique. What should I say to a goat?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Whatever comes naturally. Tell her about your day, your troubles, your hopes. Goats are excellent listeners and terrible gossips." The suggestion drew a smile from him, the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen since his arrival. "Well, Buttercup," he said to the brown goat, his voice taking on a conversational tone, "I suppose you'd like to know how a man goes from discussing cattle futures in boardrooms to learning barnyard skills from a woman who puts most men to shame." The goat's ears perked forward, and the milk began flowing more freely. Mara found herself smiling too, charmed by his willingness to embrace what must have seemed an absurd situation to someone of his background. "The truth is," he continued, to the goat, his hands finding the proper rhythm, "I've learned more about genuine satisfaction in the past week than in 32 years of doing what was expected of me. There's something deeply satisfying about work that produces immediate, tangible results." "Careful," Mara warned, though her tone was teasing. "You're starting to sound like a convert to honest labor." "Maybe I am," he replied seriously. "Maybe? That's what I've been searching for, without knowing it, the chance to build something with my own efforts, rather than simply managing what others built before me." Evening brought storytelling by the fire, a tradition that had developed naturally as they shared simple meals and found comfort in each other's company. Weston proved an engaging narrator, with tales of cattle drives and ranch life that painted vivid pictures of a world vastly different from her frontier existence. But it was the quieter stories that revealed the most his loneliness, despite being surrounded by people. His sense of being trapped in a role that fit him poorly. His growing conviction that there had to be more to life than profitable marriages and business expansion. "Tell me about your parents," she asked one evening, curious about the people who had shaped his conflicted relationship with wealth and duty. "My father is a brilliant businessman who sees every relationship in terms of profit and loss," Weston replied, staring into the fire. He genuinely believes that love is a weakness that interferes with sound judgment. My mother learned to find satisfaction in social prominence and charitable works, accepting that affection was less important than security. Were they ever happy? I think they were content, which my father considers more valuable than happiness. Content people don't make impulsive decisions that threaten family fortunes. He glanced at her. What about yours? Mara's expression softened with memory. They loved each other with the kind of devotion that seems almost foolish when you're young, but starts to look like wisdom as you get older. Papa courted Mama for 2 years before she'd even consider marrying him, said she wanted to be sure. He loved her for herself, and not just her father's land. And did he? He loved her so completely that when she died giving birth to my stillborn brother, he never looked at another woman. Spent the rest of his life talking to her gravestone, like she was sitting right beside him. She wiped away a tear she hadn't realized had formed. He used to say that some people are lucky enough to find their other half in this world, and the rest just have to make do with companionship. The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with shared understanding of the loneliness that came from settling for less than what the heart truly wanted. Both of them had experienced the hollow ache of relationships built on convenience rather than connection, his through family pressure, hers through misplaced trust. I used to think my parents' marriage sounded tragic, Weston said eventually. A brilliant man wasting emotional energy on someone who died years earlier. But listening to you describe it, I'm beginning to think he might have been the fortunate one. How so? He knew what real love felt like. He had something worth grieving for. Weston's voice was quiet, but certain. My parents never experienced anything worth that level of devotion. They made a successful partnership, but they never found their other half. As the fire burned low and they prepared for sleep, Mara found herself watching him with new understanding. This man who had inherited everything was searching for something that couldn't be bought or arranged or passed down through generations. He was looking for the kind of connection her parents had shared, the kind that made all other considerations secondary. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Thrilled because she recognized in herself the same desperate hunger for authentic love. Terrified because she was pregnant with another man's child, penniless, and facing an uncertain future that seemed to offer little room for the luxury of romantic dreams. But as she lay listening to his steady breathing across the cabin, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be loved with the kind of devotion her father had shown her mother. The thought was dangerous, impractical, and utterly compelling. The second week of Weston's recovery brought a thaw that was both meteorological and emotional. The relentless cold that had gripped the valley began to ease, allowing them brief forays outside the cabin's confines. But more significantly, the careful walls they'd each built around their hearts started to show cracks that let in dangerous possibilities. Mara had been working on her mother's wedding blanket each evening, the soft wool growing into something beautiful despite her inexperience with such fine needlework. The blanket was meant for her baby, a tangible connection to the grandmother who would never hold her grandchild. The cream-colored wool bore a pattern of intertwined roses that her mother had started years ago, intending it as a wedding gift that circumstances had never allowed her to complete. "Tell me about this," Weston said one evening, settling beside her chair to examine the intricate work. His proximity sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. "My mother began it for her own wedding, but never finished. She always said she'd complete it someday when she had daughters to marry." Mara's fingers traced the delicate pattern, each stitch a prayer for the child she'd soon hold. "Now I'm finishing it for my baby, hoping she'll understand someday that love persists across generations, even when people don't." The sadness in her voice seemed to reach something deep in Weston's chest. Without conscious thought, he covered her hand with his own, offering comfort through touch that spoke louder than words. The contact sent electricity between them that neither had expected, a recognition of connection that went beyond shared circumstances or mutual loneliness. "She understand," he said quietly. "Children born from love always recognize it, even when the world tries to convince them otherwise." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, Both acknowledged what had been growing between them, despite every practical reason why it shouldn't. He was a wealthy heir, running from family expectations. She was a pregnant woman, abandoned by the man who'd sworn to love her. Their circumstances should have made romance impossible. Yet something deeper than logic was drawing them together with irresistible force. The spell was broken by a sharp pain that made Mara gasp and press her hand to her side. The baby had been unusually active lately, her movements becoming more pronounced as space grew scarce. This particular kick, however, was strong enough to take Mara's breath away. "Are you all right?" Weston's concern was immediate and genuine, his hand moving instinctively to support her. "She's just reminding me that she's running out of room," Mara managed, though the intensity of the movement had left her shaken. "The midwife in town said active babies are healthy babies, but I'm beginning to wonder if this one intends to kick her way into the world." "How long since you've seen a doctor?" The question revealed his privileged background as clearly as silk gloves had. In his world, medical care was readily available, pregnancy monitored by professionals, birth attended by skilled physicians. In her world, women managed with folk wisdom, neighbor women, and prayers that nothing went wrong during the most dangerous hours of their lives. "There's no doctor closer than the settlement, and that's 15 miles through country that's been impassable for weeks," she explained. "Most women here rely on experience and hope." The inadequacy of such arrangements clearly troubled him. "What if there are complications?" "Then I deal with them as they come," she said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that frontier life demanded. "Worrying about what might happen is a luxury I can't afford." But Weston couldn't dismiss his concern so easily. That night, she woke to find him standing by the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape with an expression of deep concentration. The sight of him silhouetted against the pale, light, broad shoulders tense with worry, hair rumpled from sleep-stirred feelings she'd tried to suppress. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. He turned, and even in the dim light, she could see the conflict in his features. "I keep thinking about what you said, about dealing with complications as they come. In my world, we plan for contingencies, have resources available for every possibility. The idea that you might face childbirth without proper medical care." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "It feels wrong to know you're taking such risks alone." "I'm not alone anymore," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Weston crossed the cabin in 3 quick strides, settling on the edge of her cot with careful attention to propriety, even as his emotions clearly urged him closer. "Mara," he said, her name a prayer and a question all at once. "This is foolish," she whispered, even as she made no move to increase the distance between them. "You're running from one impossible situation. You don't need to complicate your life with another." "What if I want the complication?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if I've discovered that a complicated life with someone I care about is infinitely preferable to a simple life with someone I don't?" The honesty of his confession broke down her remaining defenses. Here was a man who could have any woman he wanted, whose family connections could secure him a comfortable future, yet he was offering his heart to a pregnant woman with nothing to give but her own scarred affection. "You don't know what you're saying," she protested weakly. "Once this baby comes, once the reality of raising another man's child sets in—" "This baby," he interrupted, his hand moving to rest gently on her rounded belly, "would be lucky to have a mother who's shown such courage and strength. And any man would be fortunate to help raise a child who's already survived so much adversity." The tenderness in his touch, the certainty in his voice, nearly undid her completely. She'd spent months preparing to face motherhood alone, steeling herself for the challenges of raising a child without support or security. The possibility that someone might willingly share those burdens, might even find joy in them, was almost too wonderful to believe. "Your family will never accept this," she said, though her resistance was crumbling with each gentle movement of his thumb across her belly. "Then perhaps it's time I learned to live without their acceptance," he replied. "I've spent 32 years trying to meet expectations that were never mine to begin with. Maybe it's time I set my own standards for what constitutes a successful life." Outside, the wind that had been their constant companion for weeks finally stilled, leaving a silence so complete it felt sacred. Inside the cabin, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances began to acknowledge that some connections transcend logic, social position, and practical considerations. When Weston finally returned to his own cot, the space between them felt charged with possibility. Both knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained were no longer sufficient to contain what was growing between them. The morning would bring new challenges, new questions about the future, but now they had the peace of knowing they were no longer facing those challenges. A lone got march arrived with a tentative promise of spring, though winter maintained its grip on the high country with the stubbornness of someone unwilling to admit defeat. The snow had begun its slow retreat, revealing patches of brown earth that looked almost foreign after months of unrelieved white. But with the changing season came new urgencies that neither Mara nor Weston could ignore. Her pregnancy had progressed to the point where even simple tasks required careful planning. The baby's movements had grown so pronounced that Weston could see them from across the cabin's sudden bulges, appearing and disappearing across her belly as their child shifted and stretched in increasingly cramped quarters. He'd taken to speaking to the baby during quiet moments, his hand resting on Myra's rounded stomach as he shared stories of the world awaiting outside the cabin walls. "She's going to be a strong one," he said one morning, feeling the firm kick that greeted his paw. "Takes after her mother." "Don't be so certain it's a girl," Mara replied, though she found comfort in his assumption. A daughter would face fewer doors closed by circumstance of birth, fewer expectations to fulfill beyond those she chose for herself. The half-finished baby blanket had become a focal point of their evening routine. Mara worked on the intricate pattern while Weston read aloud from the few books in the cabin, her father's worn Bible, a volume of poetry her mother had treasured, and a practical guide to frontier farming that had proven surprisingly useful for a man learning to live by his own efforts. The domestic tranquility of these moments felt both natural and miraculous, a preview of the life they might build together if circumstances allowed. But circumstances, as they both knew, rarely allowed for simple happiness. "I've been thinking about the future," Weston said one evening, setting aside the book of poetry to focus entirely on her. "About what happens when travel becomes possible again." The subject they'd been avoiding could no longer be delayed. Spring would bring choices that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. His family would be searching for him, expecting answers about the arranged marriage he'd fled. Her baby would arrive within weeks, requiring decisions about how and where to raise a child whose father had abandoned them both. "You'll return to Texas," Mara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Face whatever consequences await you there." "That's one possibility," he agreed. "Another is that I send word to my family, explaining that I won't be returning to the life they've planned for me." The suggestion was so radical, so completely contrary to everything she understood about family obligation and social expectation, that she nearly dropped her needlework. "You can't simply abandon your inheritance, your responsibilities." "Can't I?" His voice held a quiet determination that was becoming familiar. "What if I've discovered that responsibility means something different than I was taught? What if my true obligation is to build a life based on love rather than profit? And how would you support a family without your inheritance?" The practical question was necessary, though it felt like sacrilege to reduce their feelings to matters of finance, the same way other men do through honest work and careful planning. He gestured around the cabin, which had become proof of his growing competence. "I've learned to split wood, tend animals, manage a household. There are ranches throughout this territory that would value an experienced hand, regardless of his background." The image he painted was appealing in its simplicity, but Mara had lived too long with the realities of frontier existence to embrace romantic notions. Ranch work pays enough to support a single man, maybe a couple without children. But a family requires more security than seasonal employment can provide. "Then I'll find other ways," he said with the confidence of someone who'd never truly faced financial limitation. "Men build successful businesses from nothing all the time. With capital, connections, and business knowledge," she countered. "Strip away your family's resources, and you're just another man with strong hands and good intentions. That's not enough to ensure a child's future. The harshness of her words was intentional, though it cost her to deliver them. Better to face reality now than to build dreams on unstable foundations. She'd learned that lesson too well with Thomas, who'd promised her security that evaporated the moment circumstances became challenging. Weston was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the truth of her assessment. When he spoke again, his voice carried less certainty, but no less determination. You're right that I've never faced true financial hardship, but I'm not afraid of learning, of starting from the bottom and building something real. Starting over is easier when you're young and have nothing to lose, Mara said gently. You'd be giving up everything you've known for an uncertain future with a woman who has more problems than prospects. You have more strength, courage, and integrity than any woman I've ever known, he replied firmly. If that's not perspective enough for a man seeking a meaningful life, then he's looking for the wrong things. The baby chose that moment to deliver. A particularly forceful kick, as if weighing in on their discussion. Both adults felt the movement, and both recognized the reminder it represented. Whatever decisions they made would affect not just their own futures, but the life of an innocent child who deserved better than uncertainty and struggle. There's something else we need to discuss, Mara said, her hand moving protectively over her belly. The traveling preacher, Reverend Morrison, comes through the valley every few months. If he arrives before the baby, she trailed off, leaving the implication unspoken. Marriage. The word hung between them with all its legal and social implications. In their isolated cabin, they'd been free to explore their feelings without external pressure or social convention. But the arrival of a preacher would force decisions. That couldn't be unmade, commitments that would bind them regardless of future complications. Would you want that? Weston asked carefully. Marriage to a man who's still sorting out his relationship with his own family. I want my child to have a name and a father who chooses to claim her, Mara replied honestly. But I won't trap you into obligations you might regret when the romance of frontier life wears thin. And what if the romance never wears thin? What if I've found exactly what I was searching for without knowing it? The intensity of his gaze made her heart race, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. What if your family cuts you off completely? What if you find that love doesn't compensate for the loss of everything else you valued? Then I'll discover whether I'm the man I think I'm becoming or just another spoiled rich boy playing it. Independence, he said simply. But I'd rather find out with you beside me than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Outside, the wind carried the scent of change-melting snow, warming earth, and the possibility of new beginnings. Inside the cabin, two people faced the most important decision of their lives, knowing that whatever they chose would determine not just their own happiness, but the future of the child who would soon join them in a world that offered no guarantees. Beyond the strength of the love they could build together, that the arrival of March's second week brought more than warming temperatures. It brought the harsh reminder that their isolated sanctuary couldn't shelter them from the world indefinitely. Mara had been sorting through her few possessions, preparing what little she owned for the baby's arrival, when her fingers closed around the small velvet pouch she kept hidden beneath her mother's Bible. Inside lay Thomas Crawford's gold wedding ring, the band he'd placed on her finger with promises that had proven as fragile as spring ice. She'd kept the ring not from sentiment, but from practicality. Gold held value that might someday mean the difference between survival and starvation. Now, holding it in her palm while Weston worked outside repairing the cabin's winter-damaged roof, she found herself questioning everything she'd believed about love, commitment, and the wisdom of trusting her heart to another man. Mara? Weston's voice came from the doorway, accompanied by the sound of his boots being scraped clean. The Anderson boy is riding up the valley. Looks like he's heading this way. Her fingers closed reflexively around the ring as 16-year-old Billy Henderson approached the cabin on his father's sturdy mare. The Andersons were their nearest neighbors, good people who'd offered help during her father's final illness, and checked on her periodically through the winter. Billy's arrival meant news from the outside world and possibly complications she wasn't ready to face. "Miss Mara," Billy called, touching his hat respectfully as he dismounted. His eyes moved curiously to Weston, taking in the stranger's improved appearance and obvious comfort around the homestead. "Ma sent me to check on you, see how you're faring with the baby coming so soon." "I'm managing well, Billy. Thank you for asking." She tucked the ring into her apron pocket, noting how Weston moved protectively closer without seeming to think. "About it, what news from town?" "Reverend Morrison's coming through next week, planning to hold services at our place before moving on to the settlement." "Ma thought you might want to know, especially with—" Billy's gaze moved meaningfully between her and Weston, drawing conclusions that weren't entirely incorrect. The implications hit both adults simultaneously. A traveling preacher meant the possibility of marriage, but it also meant external scrutiny of their unconventional arrangement. The Valley's residents were generally tolerant of necessity-driven partnerships, but a pregnant woman living unmarried with a man would require explanation or legitimization. "That's kind of your mother to think of me," Mara said carefully. "Please give her my regards." After Billy's departure, the cabin felt smaller, charged with unspoken tensions. Weston busied himself with unnecessary tasks while Mara prepared their midday meal, both avoiding the conversation that Billy's visit had made inevitable. "You kept his ring," Weston said finally, noting the telltale bulge in her apron pocket. "I kept something that might have value if times got desperate enough," she corrected, though the distinction felt hollow even to her own ears. "Is that all it represents?" The question forced her to examine feelings she'd tried to bury beneath practical concerns. Thomas's ring symbolized more than abandoned promises. It represented her fear of trusting again, her terror that love was a luxury she couldn't afford twice in one lifetime. "It represents a reminder," she said honestly, "that men can walk away from their promises when keeping them becomes inconvenient." Weston set down the harness he'd been mending and moved to face her directly. "Do you believe I'm the kind of man who makes promises he doesn't intend to keep?" "I believe you're a good man who's caught up in extraordinary circumstances," she replied. "But I also believe that when those circumstances change, when you're faced with choosing between comfort and struggle, family approval and social exile, you might discover that your feelings aren't as strong as you think they are." The words hung between them like an accusation, though she'd intended them as protection for both of them. Better to acknowledge the possibility of future disappointment than to build hopes that couldn't survive contact with reality. "What would convince you?" he asked quietly. "What would it take for you to believe that my feelings are genuine, that my commitment wouldn't waver when tested?" Before she could answer, another pain gripped her abdomen sharper and more sustained than the baby's usual movements. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing carefully through the discomfort, while Weston watched with growing alarm. "How long have you been having pains like that?" he asked. "A few days," she admitted. "They're probably just the baby settling into position. First babies often take their time." But even as she spoke the reassurance, doubt crept into her voice. The pains had been increasing in frequency and intensity, suggesting that her child might arrive sooner than expected. The prospect of labor beginning before Reverend Morrison's arrival, before any decisions about marriage could be made, added another layer of urgency to their situation. That evening, as they shared what had become their customary fireside conversation, the weight of impending change hung over them like gathering storm clouds. Spring's approach meant the end of their isolation, the return of external pressures and social expectations they'd been free to ignore while winter held the world at bay. "If you married me," Weston said carefully, "would it be for love or legitimacy?" The directness of his question demanded an equally honest answer. "I don't know," Mara said. "I know I care for you more than I thought possible after Thomas's betrayal. I know that watching you split wood and milk goats and read poetry to my unborn child has shown me what partnership could look like with the right person. But I also know that love doesn't pay for food or medical care or the thousand things a child needs to thrive. And I know that asking a man to give up everything he's known for a future that offers no guarantees is asking too much." Weston was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression of deep concentration. When he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. "What if I told you I've already made my choice?" What if I said that the past month has shown me more about genuine happiness than 32 years of meeting other people's expectations? I'd say that a month of playing house in a snowbound cabin isn't the same as building a real life together. Then let me prove it, he said, turning to face her fully. Let me send word to my family that I won't be returning to Texas, that I'm choosing to build something here that's mine rather than inherited. The proposal was both thrilling and terrifying. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to embrace the possibility of love and partnership that he offered. But the larger part, the part shaped by abandonment and hardship, urged caution. And if they cut you off completely? If you find yourself with no resources and a family to support? Then I'll learn what I'm truly made of, he replied simply. And I'll discover whether love really is stronger than comfort. Outside, the wind that had been their constant companion began to shift, carrying new scents and the promise of change. Inside the cabin, two people stood at the crossroads of their lives, knowing that the decisions they made in the next few days would determine not just their own futures, but the legacy they'd leave for the child who would soon join them in whatever world they chose to create. The sound of approaching horses reached them on a Thursday morning when the last stubborn patches of snow were finally surrendering to spring's advance. Mara, now so heavy with child that even simple movements required careful planning, was hanging. Baby clothes on a line stretched between two pines when the rhythmic thunder of multiple hooves echoed across the valley. Weston emerged from the barn where he'd been tending to his mare, his face immediately tensing with recognition. How many? Mara asked, though she could already see the answer cresting the ridge. A caravan of elegant carriages flanked by mounted riders, their procession as out of place in the Montana wilderness as peacocks in a chicken coop. 4 carriages, 8. Outriders, Weston replied, his voice carrying resignation rather than surprise. My family doesn't do anything by half measures. The lead carriage bore the distinctive Hawley crest, the same longhorn design that graced Weston's pocket watch, worked in gold leaf against deep burgundy paint. Even travel-stained from the journey, the vehicles spoke of wealth that could command comfort even in the harshest circumstances. Behind them came supply wagons and what appeared to be a small army of servants, creating a temporary settlement that seemed to have materialized from another world entirely. Mara's first instinct was to retreat into the cabin, to avoid the judgment and scrutiny that such people would surely direct toward a pregnant woman of obviously modest circumstances. But Weston caught her arm gently, his touch conveying both support and resolve. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we face it together. The lead carriage drew to a halt 20 yards from the cabin, and a liveried footman leaped down to assist. Its occupants. The first to emerge was a woman of perhaps 55, her traveling clothes cut from fabric that cost more than Mara's annual expenses. Despite the rigors of frontier travel, she maintained the bearing of someone accustomed to command, her silver hair perfectly arranged beneath a hat that managed to be both practical and elegant. Behind her came a man who could only be Weston's. Father tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that filled whatever space he occupied. His clothes spoke of wealth without ostentation, and his weathered hands suggested someone who'd built an empire through personal effort rather than mere inheritance. Most surprising of all, his expression as he surveyed the humble homestead wasn't the disdain Mara had expected, but something approaching curiosity. The third passenger was a young woman of perhaps 22, her traveling dress stylish enough for city society, but practical enough for frontier conditions. She moved with the confident grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, yet her eyes held intelligence and warmth that suggested depth beyond social accomplishment. Weston, his father called, his voice carrying across the space. Between them with quiet authority. You look well. It was true. The man who'd collapsed half-frozen in a snowdrift 6 weeks earlier bore little resemblance to the confident rancher who now stepped forward to meet his family. Months of honest labor had broadened his shoulders and strengthened his hands, while responsibility and purpose had added gravity to his bearing that no amount of inherited privilege could provide. Father, mother, Catherine. Weston's greeting was respectful but wary, his body positioned protectively near Mara, despite the obviously awkward circumstances. This is quite a delegation for retrieving one wayward son. "We didn't come to retrieve you," his mother said, her cultured voice carrying surprising warmth. "We came to meet the woman who saved your life." The unexpected statement shifted the entire dynamic of the encounter. Mara had braced herself for condescension, demands that Weston return to his proper place, perhaps even offers of money in exchange for releasing their heir from unsuitable entanglements. Instead, she found herself being regarded with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Mrs. Ellison," Weston's father said, removing his hat with the courtesy due to a lady of quality rather than a pregnant homesteader. "I'm Charles Hawley. This is my wife, Margaret, and our daughter, Catherine. We owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid." "Any decent person would have done the same," Mara replied, the standard response that had become automatic when people thanked her for basic human kindness. "Perhaps," Margaret Hawley agreed, "but not everyone would have done it so well, or at such personal cost." Her eyes moved meaningfully to Mara's advanced pregnancy, acknowledging the additional burden that caring for a stranger must have represented. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the second carriage, from which emerged a distinguished gentleman in traveling clothes that marked him as legal counsel. He carried a leather satchel that suggested official business, and his deferential manner toward the Hales indicated significant professional standing. "Weston," his father continued, "we've brought someone who needs to speak with both of you. Mr. Patterson has been handling some family business that directly concerns Mrs. Ellison." The lawyer approached with the measured steps of someone bearing news of considerable import. From his satchel, he withdrew a document heavy with legal seals and official stamps, clearly a deed or similar property instrument. "Mrs. Ellison," Patterson said formally, "I represent the estate of Jacob Morrison, your father's brother, who recently passed in Denver. Are you familiar with your uncle's circumstances?" Mara felt the world tilt slightly. She'd known of Uncle Jacob's existence, but had lost contact with him years earlier. When he'd moved west seeking opportunities her father had been too cautious to pursue. "I haven't heard from him since before Papa's death," she managed. "Your uncle accumulated considerable property holdings before his passing," Patterson continued. "Having no children of his own, he left everything to his brother's daughter, you, Mrs. Ellison, including the section of land immediately adjacent to your current homestead." The revelation struck like lightning in clear skies. Not only was she not the penniless widow she'd believed herself to be, but she was apparently the owner of property that would make her one of the more substantial landowners in the territory. But Patterson wasn't finished. "There's more, Mrs. Ellison. The Hawley family has been searching for your uncle's heir for several months, intending to make an offer for his land to expand their northern operations. When they learned that the heir was the woman who'd saved their son's life." He paused, allowing the implications to settle. Charles Hawley stepped forward, his expression combining business acumen with genuine gratitude. "We'd like to purchase your uncle's land, Mrs. Ellison, but not as strangers conducting a transaction. We'd like to do it as family, offering a price that reflects both the property's value and our debt to you." "Family?" Mara echoed, confused by the implication. "The deed we're offering isn't just for your uncle's land," Margaret Hawley explained gently. "It includes the adjacent property we're purchasing from the territorial government, nearly 2,000 acres total, with water rights and mineral claims. Enough to establish a ranch that could support a family for generations." The scope of what they were proposing began to dawn on both Mara and Weston. This wasn't charity or condescension. It was a genuine offer to make them partners in an enterprise that would establish their independence while honoring the connection that had brought them together. "There's one more thing," Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice carrying affection and mischief in equal measure. "Eleanor Whitman married Harrison Caldwell last month. Quite suddenly, according to reports. Something about true love conquering social expectations." Her smile was directed at her brother. "It seems you're no longer required to fulfill that particular family obligation." The final piece of information completed the transformation of their circumstances. Weston was free from the arranged marriage that had driven him north. Mara was the owner of substantial property, and his family was offering not just acceptance, but partnership in building something new. "Why?" Weston asked his father directly. Why offer all this instead of simply demanding that I return home? Charles Hale's weathered face showed something that might have been pride. Because the man who nearly died seeking his own path isn't the same spoiled boy who left Texas 6 months ago. Because the woman who saved him has shown more courage and character than most people display in a lifetime. And because sometimes the best way to preserve a family legacy is to let it grow in unexpected directions. As the implications of their transformed circumstances settled over the valley like morning mist, Mara found herself holding the deed that represented not just land, but the possibility of a future she'd never dared to imagine. The gold ring, in her pocket, symbol of broken promises and shattered trust, suddenly seemed less important than the documents that promised new beginnings. The transformation of their circumstances required an equally dramatic adjustment of expectations, and the Hawley family proved remarkably adept at adapting to frontier conditions. Within hours of their arrival, what had been a remote homestead became a bustling temporary settlement as servants erected pavilions for dining and sleeping, created cooking facilities that could accommodate the enlarged party, and established the kind of organized comfort that money and experience could provide even in wilderness conditions. Margaret Hawley had taken charge of preparations with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex households, but her attention focused particularly on Mara's obvious need for rest and care. The older woman's concern was genuine rather than performative, born from personal experience with the challenges of frontier childbirth. "Catherine and I have both attended births," she explained to Mara as they sat in the cabin while the men discussed property boundaries and business arrangements outside. "My daughter has been working with the midwives in San Antonio, learning skills that seemed romantic when she was 16, but have proven quite practical." Catherine, who had been examining Mara's makeshift preparations for the baby's arrival, looked up with an expression of professional assessment. "How frequent are your pains?" she asked directly. "Every few hours, but they're not regular yet," Mara replied, though even as she spoke, another contraction gripped her abdomen with increasing intensity. This one was strong enough to make her gasp and grip the arm of her chair, a reaction that didn't escape either woman's notice. "That's changed since this morning," Margaret observed. "Weston mentioned you've been having discomfort for several days." "First babies often take their time," Mara said, reading the reassurance she'd been giving herself for weeks. But the pain that had just passed felt different from the preparatory contractions she'd been experiencing, more purposeful, more insistent. From his vest pocket, Weston's father had withdrawn not just his own pocket watch, but an ornate iron key that gleamed with recent polishing. The key was clearly old, its metal bearing the patina of years and the careful craftsmanship of an earlier era. When he handed it to Mara, its weight spoke of significance beyond mere function. "This opens the strong box that contains the original deeds to your uncle's property," Charles explained. "But it also opens something more important, the future you and my son will build together, if that's what you both choose." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Keys represented access, opportunity, the unlocking of possibilities that had previously been sealed away. This particular key offered entry not just to property ownership, but to acceptance by a family whose approval could make the difference between struggle and security. "We're not asking for immediate decisions," Margaret added gently, "but we are hoping you'll consider joining our family officially, not just through circumstance, but through choice." The suggestion of marriage hung in the air with all its legal and emotional implications. But before anyone could respond, Mara was gripped by another contraction that was unmistakably different from those that had come before. This one built slowly, reaching a crescendo that left her breathless and slightly alarmed by its intensity. "How long since the last one?" Catherine asked, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone with medical training. "Perhaps 20 minutes, Mara managed, though she was beginning to suspect that her careful timeline of weeks remaining before the baby's arrival might be optimistically inaccurate. The afternoon brought a parade of revelations that seemed designed to overwhelm whatever capacity for surprise remained. Charles Howell shared stories of his own father's humble beginnings, a poor Irish immigrant who built the Hawley empire through determination and careful risk-taking rather than inherited advantage. The family's wealth, it turned out, was only 2 generations old, built by a man who'd understood the value of hard work because he'd known the alternative intimately. Your grandfather would have liked you, Charles told Weston, with what might have been the first purely approving statement he'd ever made about his son's choices. He always said that a man who couldn't build something with his own hands didn't deserve to inherit what others had built with theirs. The validation was clearly meaningful to Weston, who had spent months questioning whether his desire for independent achievement represented strength or merely self-indulgent rebellion, learning that his instincts aligned with family tradition. Rather than opposing, it seemed to provide a foundation for confidence that had been missing. But the most significant development of the afternoon was the gradual realization that Mare's labor was beginning in earnest. The contractions that had been sporadic and manageable were becoming regular, intense, and impossible to ignore. By early evening, they were occurring every 15 minutes with a force that left no doubt about their purpose. "We need to prepare for the possibility that this baby will arrive tonight," Margaret announced with the calm authority of someone who'd managed similar situations before. "Catherine, gather your supplies. Charles, send someone to find Reverend Morrison if he's anywhere in the territory." "Why the Reverend?" Weston asked, though his expression suggested he understood the implications. "Because if this child is born tonight, it should be born to married parents," his mother replied matter-of-factly. "And because some ceremonies shouldn't be delayed for the sake of perfect timing." The suggestion that they might be married within hours, with Mara in labor and his family as witnesses, seemed both wildly romantic and utterly practical. The frontier demanded adaptability, the ability to make life's most important decisions quickly when circumstances didn't allow for lengthy deliberation. "Is that what you want?" Weston asked Mara directly, his hand finding hers as another contraction built to its peak. "To be married tonight, with all the uncertainty and chaos that implies?" "I want my child to have a father who chooses to claim her," Mara replied, her words made more poignant by the obvious effort required to speak through increasing discomfort. "And I want to face whatever comes next with someone who's proven he won't run when things get difficult." The decision made, the cabin became a hive of purposeful activity. Catherine took charge of preparing for the birth with supplies that the family's foresight had included in their traveling. Provisions clean, linens, medical instruments, and pain remedies that represented a level of care Mara had never expected to receive. Margaret organized the domestic arrangements that would be necessary for both a wedding and a birth, while Charles sent riders in multiple directions seeking Reverend Morrison or any other qualified clergy who might be within reach. As darkness fell across the valley, the contractions intensified to the point where Mara could no longer participate in conversations or planning. The baby who had been an abstract future possibility was becoming an immediate reality that demanded all her attention and strength. Between contractions, she found moments of clarity in which the surreal nature of their circumstances struck her with almost humorous force. 6 weeks ago, I thought I'd be facing this alone," she told Weston during one of the brief respites between pains. "Now I'm surrounded by more help than most women receive in cities. 6 weeks ago, I thought my life was over because I couldn't force myself to marry someone I didn't love," he replied, his hand stroking her hair with gentle reverence. "Now I'm about to marry someone I can't imagine living without." The arrival of Reverend Morrison near midnight seemed like divine intervention, though the practical explanation was that Billy Anderson had found him at the Murphy Ranch and convinced him that an emergency wedding was required. The elderly minister took in the Sena woman in advanced labor, a nervous groom-to-be and a family of obvious wealth gathered in a humble frontier cabin and simply nodded as if such circumstances were perfectly normal. "Well then," he said, setting down his traveling bag and removing his worn Bible, "let's begin with the wedding, shall we? Babies have their own timing, but marriages require conscious choice." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything any of them had. Mara, supported between contractions by both Weston and Catherine, spoke her vows with a voice that carried absolute conviction despite her physical distress. Weston's promises were delivered with the intensity of someone who understood that words spoken under such circumstances carried weight beyond normal social convention. "Do you, Weston Charles Hawley, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part. I do, Weston replied, his eyes never leaving Mara's face as another. Contraction built and passed. Do you, Mara Elizabeth Ellison, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do, she managed, her answer coming in the brief space between contractions. The exchange of rings was improvised. Weston used the simple gold band his mother removed from her own finger, a symbol of love that had endured for 35 years, and countless challenges. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender rather than passionate, appropriate for the sacred moment they were creating together. But even as they became officially married, the more urgent business of bringing their child into the world demanded immediate attention. The contractions that had been manageable during the brief ceremony were now coming with relentless force, announcing that the baby, who had waded through winter storms and family revelations, was finally ready to make her entrance into a world that had been transformed to welcome her. The hours that followed the wedding ceremony blurred together in a haze of mounting intensity and focused purpose. Mara's labor progressed with the relentless determination of nature, following its own timeline, while around her, the makeshift delivery room organized itself with surprising efficiency. Catherine had taken charge of the medical aspects with competence that belied her youth, while Margaret provided the kind of steady, experienced support that came from having attended dozens of frontier births. Weston refused to leave, despite repeated suggestions that expectant fathers traditionally waited elsewhere during delivery. His presence wasn't merely symbolic. He held Mara's hand through each contraction, offering physical support and emotional anchor when the pain threatened to overwhelm her determination. The man who 6 weeks earlier had never imagined being present for childbirth now seemed incapable of being anywhere else. You don't have to stay, Mara managed between contractions, though her grip on his hand suggested she hoped he would ignore the offer. I'm not going anywhere, he replied with quiet certainty. We're in this together, remember? The cabin that had sheltered their growing love now became the backdrop for its ultimate expression. Every item they'd shared during their weeks of isolation seemed to bear witness to this culminating moment. The fire that had warmed them through winter storms, the table where they'd shared simple meals and complex conversations, the window through which they'd watched seasons change and possibilities unfold. Catherine's medical supplies proved invaluable, as complications that might have proven dangerous in isolation were managed with professional competence. When Mara's blood pressure elevated during transition, Catherine administered herbal remedies that helped stabilize her condition. When the baby's position seemed problematic, experienced hands guided mother and child through the necessary adjustments. She's crowning, Catherine announced with excitement that broke through her clinical demeanor. I can see dark hair, lots of it. The revelation that their child was indeed female, as they both somehow intuited, added another layer of emotion to a nigh already overwhelming experience. Weston found himself thinking of the strong women who had shaped his understanding of courage, his mother's quiet resilience, his sister's professional competence, and most of all, Mara's fierce determination to build a life of meaning despite every obstacle. The final stage of labor arrived with startling suddenness. One moment, Mara was enduring contractions that seemed manageable despite their intensity. The next, an urgent need to push overwhelmed every other consideration. Her body took control of the process with ancient wisdom, guided by instincts that had successfully brought children into the world for countless generations. Almost there, Catherine encouraged, her hands positioned to receive the baby, whose emergence was now inevitable. One more strong push should do it. Mara drew upon reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, her entire being focused on the singular task of bringing her daughter safely into the world. Weston's presence anchored her, his steady voice providing encouragement when her own will faltered. And then, in a rush of fluid and relief that marked the transition from pregnancy to motherhood, their daughter entered the world with a cry that proclaimed her healthy lungs and strong spirit. The sound filled the cabin with joy so pure that even Charles Hallé, who had remained diplomatically outside during the delivery, found his eyes damp with unexpected emotion. She's perfect, Catherine announced, lifting the baby for her parents. First glimpse, absolutely perfect. The child who had been an abstract possibility for so many months suddenly became a tangible reality, tiny fingers that gripped reflexively, eyes that opened to survey her new environment with what seemed like intelligent curiosity, and a voice that demanded immediate attention to her needs and preferences. Weston's first sight of his daughter, for she was his daughter in every way, that mattered, struck him with emotions he'd never imagined possible. This small person represented not just the future he and Mara would build together, but the legacy he would leave beyond his own lifetime. She was living proof that love could indeed triumph over circumstance, that families could be created through choice rather than mere biology. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "Welcome to the world." Mara, exhausted but radiant, reached for her daughter with hands that trembled from effort and emotion. The moment their child was placed in her arms, the months of uncertainty and fear dissolved into pure maternal devotion. This was what she'd been fighting for through lonely winter nights and difficult decisions. Not just survival, but the opportunity to love and protect this precious life. "What will you name her?" Margaret asked softly, her own emotions clearly affected by witnessing the profound transformation that had taken place in her son. And new daughter-in-law. Mara looked at Weston, seeking his input on the decision that would give their daughter her identity. They had discussed names during their weeks together, but those conversations had been theoretical, abstract planning for a future that seemed impossibly distant. Now that future had arrived with 10 tiny fingers, and the most beautiful cry either parent had ever heard. "Hope," Mara said simply. "Her name is Hope Elizabeth Hawley." The choice was perfect, a name that honored both the circumstances of her conception and the promise of her future, while acknowledging the family that had welcomed her with such unexpected grace. Asterisk. The hours following Hope's birth transformed the humble cabin into something approaching a royal nursery, though the royalty in question was a 7-pound infant, who seemed blissfully unaware of the profound changes her arrival had wrought. Mara, despite her exhaustion, found herself unable to sleep as she watched her daughter's tiny chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of new life taking root in the world. Weston had positioned himself in the chair beside the bed, his large hands cradling Hope with the careful reverence of someone holding the most precious cargo imaginable. The sight of this man who had fled from one set of family obligations, now embracing another so completely, would have been amusing if it weren't so deeply moving. Every small sound the baby made drew his immediate attention. Every minute change in her expression was catalogued and celebrated. "She has your chin," Margaret observed softly, having appointed herself official grandmother and taken the role seriously enough to maintain almost constant vigil. "And those are definitely Hawley eyes. We all start with that particular shade of blue before they settle into their permanent color." The observation was significant beyond mere genetics. By claiming resemblance to the Hawley family line, Margaret was officially acknowledging Hope as a true granddaughter rather than a stepchild accepted out of necessity. The distinction mattered in ways that went far beyond social convention. It spoke to inheritance rights, family standing, and the child's place in a legacy that stretched back generations. "We need to discuss the christening," Charles said from his position near the fire, his voice carrying the practical authority of someone accustomed to managing important family events. "Reverend Morrison is still here, and it seems appropriate to complete all the religious observances while we have the opportunity." The suggestion made sense on multiple levels. Having Hope officially welcomed into the Christian faith would provide spiritual grounding that both parents valued, while also creating formal documentation of her birth and legitimacy that might prove important in legal matters. More immediately, it would give the extended family an opportunity to express their acceptance of the newest Hawley through ceremonial blessing. From her jewelry case, Margaret withdrew a ring that seemed almost too delicate for frontier circumstances. Simple gold band worn smooth by decades of faithful wear. The ring had clearly seen better days, its surface bearing the small scratches and dents that spoke of a life fully lived, but its modest elegance suggested sentimental value far beyond material worth. "This was my mother's wedding ring," she explained, offering it to Mara with the solemnity of a sacred trust. "She wore it for 43 years, through prosperity and hardship, sickness and health. It's not as grand as the ring Charles gave. But it represents something more enduring than wealth. It represents love that persists through every test life can devise. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This wasn't just a family heirloom being passed down. It was an acknowledgement that Mara's marriage to Weston was being recognized as legitimate and permanent rather than a temporary arrangement born of convenience. The ring connected her to a lineage of women who had built strong families through determination and devotion. "I can't accept something so precious," Mara protested, though her fingers closed around the small band with obvious reverence. "It's not a gift," Margaret replied gently. "It's an inheritance. The women in this family pass down more than jewelry. We pass down the responsibility to love our husbands and children with the kind of devotion that builds legacies." The christening ceremony that followed was as intimate and meaningful as the wedding had been, though conducted under considerably calmer circumstances. Hope, swaddled in the soft wool blanket her mother had been completing for weeks, submitted to the religious ritual with the dignified composure of someone born to important occasions. Reverend Morrison's blessing was both traditional and personal, acknowledging not just the child's entry into Christian faith, but her unique position as a symbol of love triumphant over adversity. His words carried extra weight, given his witness to the circumstances that had brought this family together, through divine providence and human courage. "Lord, we ask your blessing on this child, Hope Elizabeth Hawley, born of love that overcame every obstacle placed in its path," the Reverend intoned, his weathered hands gentle as he anointed the baby's forehead. "May she grow in wisdom and stature, surrounded by the devotion that brought her safely into this world." As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the soft pastels that promised another day of spring's advance, the assembled family began to disperse to their temporary accommodations. The crisis that had brought them together had been successfully navigated, the child safely delivered, and the new family unit officially established in both legal and religious terms. But for Weston and Mara, now officially husband and wife, and parents to the most beautiful baby either had ever seen, the night's events represented more than successful crisis management. They had proven to themselves and each other that love really could overcome practical obstacles, that families could be built on choice rather than mere circumstance, and that sometimes the greatest blessings arrived wrapped in the most unlikely packages. "Thank you," Weston whispered to his wife as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window, illuminating their daughter's peaceful face. "For what?" Mara asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "For saving my life." "In more ways than I even realized at the time," he replied, his lips brushing her forehead with tender gratitude. "For showing me what real love looks like." 3 years later, the valley that had once seemed like the edge of civilization had transformed into something approaching a small community. The ranch that Mara and Weston built on her inherited land sprawled across rolling meadows where cattle grazed contentedly under Montana's endless sky. The original cabin, now expanded with proper bedrooms and a kitchen that could accommodate family gatherings, served as the heart of an operation that had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. Hope Elizabeth Howell toddled between the main house and the barn with the fearless confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and security. Her dark hair caught sunlight as she chased chickens with more enthusiasm than success, her laughter carrying across the yard like music that announced all was well in her small world. At 3, she showed signs of inheriting both her mother's practical intelligence and her father's thoughtful nature, along with a stubborn streak that clearly came from both sides of her heritage. "Papa, up," she demanded, raising her arms toward Weston as he emerged from the barn where he'd been checking on a mare expected to foal soon. The sight never failed to move him. This small person who had complete faith in his ability to solve any problem or reach any high shelf was living proof that some risks were worth taking regardless of potential consequences. The portrait that hung above the mantelpiece in their parlor had been painted the previous summer when a traveling artist passed through the territory. The formal family portrait showed Mara seated with Hope on her lap while Weston stood behind them, his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. But what made the painting significant wasn't its artistic merit, it was its permanent place. In the Halle family gallery, positioned alongside portraits of Charles and Margaret, Catherine and her new husband, and previous generations who had built the legacy that Hope would someday inherit. "She's got your eyes, but my mother's stubborn chin," Mara observed, watching their daughter negotiate with the chickens, as if expecting them to understand reasonable arguments about sharing corn. "And your absolute conviction that the world should work according to her preferences," Weston added, scooping Hope up for the demanded elevation. "I suspect we're raising someone who'll change whatever corner of the world she decides to tackle." The prediction carried weight because they'd both learned that determination could indeed reshape circumstances that seemed immutable. Their ranch had become profitable enough to expand operations while maintaining the personal attention that kept their cattle healthy and their land productive. More importantly, they'd proven that a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection could weather the practical challenges that destroyed relationships founded on less solid ground. Letters from Texas arrived monthly, carrying news of the expanding Halle Empire and repeated invitations to visit the family headquarters. Charles and Margaret had made the journey north twice, clearly delighting in their granddaughter, while observing with satisfaction how their son had matured into someone capable of building rather than merely inheriting success. Catherine's letters were filled with stories of her medical practice and her own growing family, but always included messages for my beautiful niece, who's probably outgrown her clothes again. The neighboring Anderson ranch had become their closest alliance, with young Billy Anderson now grown into a competent rancher who'd found in Weston both mentor and friend. Mrs. Anderson had appointed herself Hope's unofficial grandmother, providing the kind of community support that made frontier life not just bearable, but genuinely fulfilling. The isolation that had once defined their existence had been replaced by the kind of chosen family that proved blood wasn't the only bond that mattered. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint. The mountains and shades of rose and gold. Hope was finally asleep after a day of adventures that had included helping Papa check fences, assisting Mama with garden weeding, and conducting serious negotiations with the barn cats about appropriate behavior around baby chicks. "Regret what?" Weston asked, though he understood the question. It was one that surfaced periodically when letters from his father contained news of business opportunities that might have been his, social events where his absence was noted, or political developments that could have benefited from his participation. Giving up the life you were raised for. The comfort, the social position, the certainty that comes with inherited wealth. Weston considered the question seriously, as he always did when she voiced doubts that never quite disappeared despite 3 years of happiness. "I gave up a life. That was planned by other people to build one that's mine," he said finally. "Every morning when I wake up next to you, every time Hope calls me Papa, every decision we make together about our future, that's not sacrifice. That's the best trade I ever made." The answer satisfied her, as it always did, though she suspected she'd ask the question again someday when doubts crept in during difficult moments. Frontier life demanded constant vigilance against forces beyond human control, weather, disease, economic fluctuation, and 1,000 smaller challenges that could accumulate into overwhelming burden. But they'd learned that facing such challenges together created strength that neither could have achieved alone. As stars emerged in the darkening sky and this house settled into the peaceful rhythms of a family at rest, Mara found herself thinking about the winter storm that had brought Weston into her life. The blizzard that had seemed like punishment at the time had actually delivered the greatest blessing she'd ever received, not just love, but the kind of partnership that made every future possibility seem manageable. "Tell me again about the storm," Hope demanded from her bedroom window, where she'd appeared despite supposedly being asleep. The story of how Mama had rescued Papa from the snow had become her favorite bedtime tale, requested with the frequency of someone who never tired of hearing about love triumphant over adversity. "Once upon a time," Mara began, settling into the familiar cadence of a story that had been told so often it had acquired the weight of family legend. "There was a very brave woman who lived alone in a cabin, and a very lost man who didn't know what he was looking for until he found it in the most unexpected place. As she spoke, Weston joined them at the window, his arms encircling both wife and daughter while the story unfolded once again. Outside, the wind that had once threatened to destroy them now carried the scent of spring flowers and the promise of another season of growth and possibility. Inside their home, three people who had found each other against all odds continued building the kind of love that would echo through generations yet to come. "Doc's right," Sheriff Watson said, holstering his weapon with visible reluctance. "We need to take this discussion elsewhere. Mrs. Callen's condition takes precedence over everything else." But even as he spoke, they all knew that leaving wasn't really an option. The storm had trapped them all, here law enforcement, criminals, and innocent bystanders alike, in a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. "I'll stay," Colt said quietly. "Whatever else has happened, whatever lies have been told, Josie shouldn't have to face this alone." "No." Her voice was weak but determined. "I don't want you here. I don't want any of your help. Josie, please. You're having a baby in the middle of a blizzard, with armed men surrounding your cabin. This isn't the time for pride or anger. This is exactly the time for both." Another contraction gripped her, and she had to pause, breathing through the pain with the deliberate focus of a woman who'd learned that survival sometimes depended on pure willpower. "You've lied to me about everything. Your name, your identity, your reasons for being here. How do I know this isn't just another deception? How do I know you're not working with Dalton, playing some elaborate game where I'm the prize?" "Because," Colt said, his voice rough with emotion, "because when I look at you, I see the only real thing left in my life. Because saving you isn't about the coal or the land or any of the complications outside that door. It's about the fact that you took $5 you couldn't afford to spend and used it to save something that couldn't save itself." The mare whinnied from the paddock, the sound carrying clearly through the storm-muffled air. Josie thought of that day at the auction, of the moment when she'd raised her hand, despite knowing she had no money to spare. It seemed like a lifetime ago, that simple act of mercy that had somehow led to this impossible tangle of love and betrayal. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, her voice steadying as another contraction passed, "what are my chances if I try to travel in this storm?" "In your condition? In this weather?" The doctor shook his head grimly. "Mrs. Callen, you're barely 7 months along. If we can keep the labor from progressing too quickly, if we can keep you calm and warm, there's a chance both you and the owl. Baby will be all right. But if you try to travel now, in a blizzard, with contractions already started," he didn't need to finish the sentence. "And if I stay here, with whatever's happening outside, then we do the best we can with what we have. It's not ideal, but at least you'll be warm and dry, and I'll be here to help if complications arise." Through the window, they could see Dalton conferring with his men, their voices lost in the wind, but their intentions clear enough. They weren't leaving, regardless of Josie's medical condition. Whatever game they were playing, whatever stakes they thought justified their actions, they were prepared to see it through to the end. "There's something else," Sheriff Watson said reluctantly. "Something I haven't told you about Dalton's mineral rights claim." "What about it?" "The territorial surveyor who filed the coal deposit report? He disappeared 3 weeks ago. His assistant says he left town suddenly, claimed he had family business back east. But his landlord found his room cleared out, and his survey equipment missing. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. If the surveyor had been bought off or threatened into filing a false report, then Dalton's entire claim might be fraudulent. But proving that would require time and legal resources that none of them possessed in the middle of a blizzard. "It gets worse," Deputy Reynolds added. "We've been investigating Dalton's business dealings for months. There's evidence that he's been using intimidation and fraud to acquire property all over the territory. This isn't just about your land, Mrs. Callen. It's about a pattern of criminal behavior that goes back years." "Then why haven't you arrested him?" "Because he's been careful. Until tonight, we never had witnesses willing to testify, never had enough evidence to make charges stick. But if what Colt Mr. Brenner says is true about his own situation, if Dalton was involved in the attempt on his life, We'd have enough to put him away for a very long time, Sheriff Watson finished. Another contraction hit Josie, stronger. Then the last, and she had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. Dr. Mitchell timed it carefully, his expression growing more concerned with each passing minute. "The contractions are getting closer together," he said quietly. "I need to examine you properly, determine how far along the labor has progressed. In front of all these men? Absolutely not. And we need to clear the room. Sheriff, can you and your men secure the perimeter while giving Mrs. Callen some privacy?" "I'll stay," Colt said again, and this time his voice carried a note of desperation. "Whatever you think of me, whatever I've done wrong, I won't abandon you, no." "You don't get to make that choice," Josie replied, but her voice lacked the fire. It had carried earlier. The pain was wearing her down, making it harder to maintain the anger that had been sustaining her. "Maybe not, but I'm making it anyway." Before anyone could argue further, they heard a commotion from outside, raised voices. The sound of horses moving, someone shouting orders. Sheriff Watson moved to the window and cursed under his breath. "What is it?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "Dalton's men are surrounding the cabin. Looks like they're planning to wait us out, storm or no storm. They can't seriously expect to maintain a siege in this weather. They can if they think what's at stake is worth the risk." As if summoned by their conversation, Dalton's voice boomed across the yard, amplified by the snow-muffled silence. "Sheriff Watson, I'm prepared to make this simple for everyone. Send out the imposter Brenner, and we'll consider Mrs. Callen's medical condition in our negotiations about the property." "Negotiations?" Josie gasped between contractions. "What does he think he's negotiating for?" "Your life," Colt said quietly. "And the baby's. He knows that as long as you're here, as long as you're in danger, no one's going to be willing to escalate the situation to violence. So I'm a human shield, your leverage. And as long as that's true, you have more power in this situation than anyone else." Dr. Mitchell had finished his preliminary examination, and his expression was grave. "Mrs. Callen, the baby is coming whether we're ready or not. The labor is progressing quickly, and I estimate you have maybe 2 hours before delivery." 2 hours, she repeated, the words feeling strange and impossible. In 2 hours, she would be a mother. In 2 hours, everything would change forever, regardless of coal deposits or property disputes or the tangled web of deception that had brought them all to this moment. "Colt," she said, his real name feeling strange on her tongue. "If you really are who you say you are, if you really have the power and resources you claim, then use them. Not for me, not to win my forgiveness or prove your love, but for this baby, for the child who didn't ask to be born into this mess. What do you want me to do? End this? Find a way to make it stop before my child comes into the world in the eye. Middle of a war zone." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a hardening of resolve, a decision being made that would change everything. "All right," he said quietly, "but when this is over, when the baby is safe and you're safe, I want the chance to explain everything. Not to ask for forgiveness, not to justify what I've done, but to tell you the truth about why I fell in love with a woman brave enough to spend her last $5 on a broken horse." Before she could respond, another contraction hit, stronger than any before, and she knew with absolute certainty that ready or not, willing or not, the future was coming whether any of them were prepared for it. The mare whinnied again from the paddock, a sound that seemed to carry across the storm like a battle cry. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the wind, they could hear the sound of more horses approaching through the snow reinforcements for someone. Though whether friend or foe remained to be seen. The newborn's first cry pierced the storm-muffled silence like a declaration of war against an impossible world. It was the sound of life refusing to be denied, of hope emerging from the heart of chaos, and for one perfect moment, everything else, the armed men outside, the legal complications, the web of deception and betrayal, fell away before the simple miracle of a child drawing breath. Dr. Mitchell worked quickly in the lamplight, his experienced hands sure and gentle, as he cleared the baby's airway and checked for signs of distress. The infant was small, as premature babies always were, but his lungs were strong and his grip fierce when he wrapped tiny fingers around the doctor's thumb. "A son," Dr. Mitchell announced, his voice carrying both relief and professional satisfaction. "Small, but perfectly formed. His breathing is good, his color is improving, and he's got the fighting spirit of his mother." Josie lay back against the pillows Colt had arranged for her face pale with exhaustion, but radiant with the particular joy that only comes from bringing new life into the world. When Dr. Mitchell placed the baby in her arms, she looked down at the small red face and felt something shift in her chest, a fierce protectiveness that made everything that had come before seem suddenly clear and simple. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Welcome to your complicated world." The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but somehow alert, and she had the strangest feeling that he was taking measure of his surroundings. With the wisdom of someone who understood that survival would require careful attention to detail. Outside, the standoff continued. Dalton's men had maintained their positions despite the worsening storm, their determination apparently stronger than their discomfort. Sheriff Watson and his deputies had established a defensive perimeter around the cabin, but everyone understood that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge where one wrong move could lead to violence. "He's beautiful," Colt said softly from his position by the window, where he'd been keeping watch throughout the long hours of labor. "He looks like his mother." "He looks like himself," Josie corrected, though there was less hostility in her voice than there had been earlier. The birth had changed something fundamental in the room's atmosphere, reminding everyone present that some things transcended human conflict and petty ambition. The mare had been restless throughout the night, pacing her paddock despite the storm, whinnying periodically as if she could sense the drama unfolding in the cabin. Now, as the baby's cries quieted to soft breathing, the horse seemed to settle as well, as if she too understood that the crisis had passed its most dangerous point. "Mrs. Callen," Dr. Mitchell said as he finished cleaning up from the delivery, "both you and the baby need rest, warmth, and proper nutrition. Under normal circumstances, I'd insist on transferring you to the hospital in the county seat, but given the storm and the ... other complications, I think you're safer staying put for now." "Other complications," Josie repeated with a tired laugh. "Is that what we're calling armed men surrounding my cabin?" "It's what we're calling a situation that requires delicate handling," Sheriff Watson interjected from his position near the door. "The good news is that we've identified at least 3 of Dalton's men as wanted fugitives. If we can take them alive, we'll have enough evidence to bring down his entire operation." "And the bad news?" "The bad news is that cornered rats tend to fight, especially when they know capture means prison or worse." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard movement outside, the crunch of boots on snow, voices conferring in urgent whispers. Colt moved away from the window and positioned himself between Josie and the door, his body language suggesting he was prepared to defend them regardless of the personal cost. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. The knock, when it came, was firm, but respectful, not the aggressive pounding they might have expected from Dalton or his hired guns. Sheriff Watson opened the door to reveal a tall woman in a snow-covered riding coat, her gray hair pulled back severely and her eyes blazing with the particular fury of someone who'd ridden through a blizzard to right a wrong. "Aunt Margaret?" Colt stared at the woman in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "What I should have done weeks ago," Margaret Whitmore replied as she stamped snow off her boots and stepped into the cabin, "taking control of a situation that's gotten entirely out of hand." She was followed by 4 men in the distinctive uniforms of territorial marshals, their badges gleaming in the lamplight and their expressions suggesting they'd come prepared for trouble. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Watson said with obvious relief, "I wasn't expecting federal involvement in this matter." "Federal involvement became necessary when we learned that Hiram Dalton has been using fraudulent mineral surveys to steal property across 3 territories. He's been running a systematic land grab operation for over 2 years, targeting widows, elderly homesteaders, and anyone else who couldn't fight back effectively." She moved to Josie's bedside, her stern expression softening as she looked down at the baby. "And you, my dear, have been caught in the middle of something much larger than a simple eviction dispute. "I don't understand," Josie said, shifting the baby protectively in her arms. "What does any of this have to do with federal marshals?" "It has to do with mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft of federal lands," one of the marshals explained. "Dalton's been filing false mineral reports with the territorial government, then using those reports to claim eminent domain over private property. It's a federal crime, and we've been building a case against him for months." "The surveyor who disappeared," Colt said, the pieces clicking into place. "He wasn't bought off, he was eliminated because he wouldn't file false reports." "Exactly. We found his body 3 days ago, along with evidence that directly implicates Dalton in his murder." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. They'd all known that Dalton was ruthless and greedy, but the idea that he was willing to commit murder to advance his schemes added a new level of danger to their situation. "Which means," Margaret Whitmore continued, "that the men outside aren't just hired guns, they're accomplices to murder. They know that if they're taken alive, they'll likely hang. That makes them extremely dangerous." As if to emphasize her point, they heard Dalton's voice booming across the yard, his words carrying a new note of desperation. "Marshal Service, I know you're in there, but you're too late. The property transfer is already complete, filed with the territorial government this morning. Mrs. Callen's lease is void, and anyone occupying my land is trespassing." "He's bluffing," one of the marshals said. "The territorial offices have been closed for 3 days due to the storm. No papers could have been filed." "Maybe," Sheriff Watson replied. "But desperate men don't always think clearly about details like that." The baby chose that moment to fuss, a small sound that somehow seemed to echo through the cabin like a reminder of what was really at stake. Josie looked down at her son Thomas's son, she reminded herself, though she wondered if the child would grow up knowing anything about the father who died before he was born. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "your nephew Colt, he told me that you offered me a position as your seamstress. Was that real, or was it part of some elaborate scheme?" "The offer was completely real, my dear. Colt may have suggested it, but the decision to hire you was entirely my own. I've seen examples of your work, and you have genuine talent. Even knowing about all this, about the danger, the complications, especially knowing about all this, you have shown remarkable courage and grace under impossible circumstances. Those are qualities I value highly." Outside, they could hear Dalton's men moving around the cabin, their voices growing more agitated as they realized that federal law enforcement had arrived. The storm was still raging, but there were signs that it might be beginning to weaken, which meant that soon, one way or another, the standoff would have to be resolved. "What happens now?" Josie asked. "Now," Marshal Davidson said grimly, "we end this. Dalton and his men are trapped by the storm just as much as we are. They can't escape, and they know it. The question is whether they'll surrender peacefully or whether they'll try to shoot their way out." The mare whinnied again from her paddock, a sound that seemed to carry both warning and encouragement. She'd witnessed the entire drama unfold, from Josie's first act of mercy at the auction to this moment of reckoning in the storm. In her own way, she'd become part of the story, a living reminder that sometimes the most important bonds were forged, not through grand gestures, but through simple acts of care and devotion. "Whatever happens," Colt said, moving closer to Josie's bedside, "I want you to know that meeting you, caring for you, watching you show kindness to a broken horse, it reminded me what it means to be human. Whatever my name is, whatever mistakes I've made, that's real." Josie looked up at him, this man who'd lied to her about everything except the feelings in his eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. The anger was still there, the hurt and betrayal, but underneath it all was the recognition that love, when it was real, had a way of surviving even the worst deceptions. "We'll talk about it," she said quietly. "When this is over, when my son is safe, we'll talk about what's real and what isn't." The baby sighed in his sleep, and outside the storm began to show signs of breaking, allowing the first pale hints of dawn to filter through the clouds. Whatever came next, whatever resolution awaited them all, it would happen in the light of a new day and in the presence of new life that had somehow found a way to enter the world despite everything trying to prevent it. The simple gold wedding band caught the morning light as Colt held it between his fingers, its surface worn smooth by years of wear, but untarnished by time or weather. It had belonged to his mother, and before her, to his grandmother, a circle of commitment that had nothing to do with the size of diamonds or the weight of precious metals, but everything to do with the promises people made when they believed in forever. "I know I have no right to ask," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of surrender happening in the yard outside. "I know I've lied about everything else, and I know trust isn't something that can be rebuilt with words or gestures. But I want you to know that what I feel for you, what I felt since that first day at the auction, that's the most honest thing in my life." Josie shifted the baby in her arms, studying Colt's face in the pale dawn light that filtered through the cabin windows. Outside, Dalton and his remaining men were being taken into custody by the federal marshals, their desperate gamble having failed when faced with overwhelming evidence of their crimes. The storm was finally breaking, revealing a world transformed by snow into something clean and new. "You're asking me to marry you," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that two people who've both been broken by life might be able to heal together. I'm asking you to think about whether your son might benefit from having a father who would love him as much as he loves his mother, even though he's not your child, especially because he's not my child. Love isn't about blood, Josie. It's about choice. It's about deciding that someone else's happiness matters more than your own comfort." The baby stirred in her arms, his tiny fist curling around her finger with surprising strength. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Thomas in those final days before the fever took him, when he'd made her promise not to spend the rest of her life mourning what they'd lost instead of embracing what might still be possible. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "if I accept this ring and everything it represents, what then? Do we pretend that the last few weeks never happened? Do we build our future on the foundation of lies you've already told? We build our future on the truth, all of it, the good and the bad, the mistakes and the moments of grace. We start over, but we start honest." Through the window, they could see Margaret Whitmore conferring with the marshals, her authoritative presence having helped bring order to chaos. She'd been instrumental in coordinating the federal investigation that had finally brought Dalton to justice, and her arrival had probably prevented the standoff from escalating into violence. "Your aunt," Josie said. "She really does want to hire me. She really does. But more than that, she wants to welcome you into the family. She's been alone on that ranch since my uncle died, and she's seizing you someone who understands the value of hard work and honest living." "And you? What do you see in me?" Colt was quiet for a moment, looking down at the ring in his palm as if it might contain the words he was searching for. "I see someone who spent her last $5 on mercy. I see someone who never gave up hope even when hope seemed foolish. I see someone strong enough to forgive, if forgiveness is deserved." The baby chose that moment to wake fully, his eyes opening to take in the faces around him with the serious attention of someone trying to make sense of a complicated world. When his gaze found Colt's, something passed between them, not recognition exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement that they might have a future together if the adults could manage not to ruin it. "He's beautiful," Colt said softly. "What will you name him?" "James," Josie replied without hesitation. "James Thomas Callen. For his father, and for the hope that he'll grow up to be the kind of man who keeps his promises." "James Thomas," Colt repeated, as if testing the weight of the name. "It's a good name. A strong name." "Colt," she said, her voice growing serious. "If I agree to this, if I take your ring in your name and your promise of a future together, I need you to understand something. I won't be your charity case, and I won't be a redemption project. I'm a grown woman with a child to raise and a life to build. If we do this, we do it as equals. I wouldn't want it any other way. And no more lies. No more protecting me from complicated truths or managing my life without my consent. If we're going to be partners, then we're going to be real partners. Agreed." She looked down at the ring again, this simple band of gold that represented so much more than its material value. It was a symbol of continuity, of the bonds that connected one generation to the next, of the faith that love could endure, even when everything else seemed uncertain. "All right," she said finally. "Yes, I'll marry you, Colt Brenner. But not because I need rescuing, and not because you need forgiving. I'll marry you because I think we might be able to build something together that's stronger than either of. Yous could manage alone." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and she was surprised by how right it felt, not foreign or presumptuous, but like something that belonged there, something that had been waiting for the right moment to claim its place. "When?" he asked. "As soon as it can be arranged properly. I want James to be old enough to remember his parents' wedding, even if he's too young to understand what it means." The door opened to admit Dr. Mitchell, who'd been checking on the horses during the morning's drama. His expression was pleased. As he looked from Josie to Colt to the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Everything settled out there?" Josie asked. "Everything settled. Dalton and his men are in custody. The mineral rights claims have been declared fraudulent, and your lease has been restored to good standing. More importantly, the federal government is prepared to offer you compensation for your suffering and to help with the legal costs of fighting Dalton's claims." "Compensation?" "Enough to ensure that you and young James will be comfortable, regardless of what other decisions you make about your future." It was, Josie thought, a remarkably neat ending to what had seemed like an impossible situation. But then, life sometimes surprised you with solutions you hadn't thought to hope for. "Dr. Mitchell," Colt said, "would you be willing to perform a wedding ceremony? Nothing elaborate, just the legal requirements and whatever words seem appropriate for the occasion." "I'd be honored, though I should point out that Mrs. Callen should rest for at least a week before undertaking any major activities." "A week gives us time to plan properly," Josie said. "Time to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons." Outside, they could hear the sounds of normal life resuming, horses being saddled, men calling to each other as they prepared to transport prisoners and evidence back to town. The mare whinnied from her paddock, a sound that seemed to express approval of the way things had turned out. "She's been through this whole adventure with us," Josie observed. "It seems only fitting that she should be present for the wedding." "A horse as witness to our vows? Why not? She's the one who brought us together in the first place. If I hadn't bought her at that auction, if you hadn't been impressed by what you saw as an act of kindness, we might never have found each other at all." Margaret Whitmore appeared in the doorway, her expression warm with approval as she took in the scene, her nephew holding hands with the woman he loved, both of them looking down at a baby who represented hope for the future. "I take it congratulations are in order?" She said. "They are," Josie replied, "though I should warn you that you're getting a very independent-minded niece who's not likely to be easily managed. Asterisk, my dear girl, the women in this family have never been easily managed. I wouldn't expect you to be any different." As the morning progressed and the various complications of the night were resolved, Josie found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow with no prospects and no hope. Today, she was a mother, a bride-to-be, and a woman who discovered that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances could lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, unaware that his entry into the world had been witnessed by armed men and federal marshals, that his first breath had been drawn in the middle of a storm that had threatened to tear apart everything his mother held dear. All he knew was warmth and love and the promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. Asterisk, the ring felt strange on her finger, but not unwelcome. It would take time to get used to, just as it would take time to learn how to trust again, how to build a life with someone whose past was as complicated as her own. But they had time, and they had patience, and they had the kind of love that was strong enough to survive even the worst mistakes. The mare whinnied once more from her paddock, and Josie smiled, understanding that sound as a benediction, a blessing, from the creature whose need for mercy had started them all on this improbable journey toward grace. The family portrait caught the golden light of late afternoon as it sat on the mantelpiece of the great room at the Rocking W Ranch, its silver frame reflecting the warmth of a home where laughter had learned to live again. In the photograph, taken 6 months after that storm-torn night when everything had changed, Josie sat in the rocking chair Colt had carved for her during the long winter evenings, baby James on her lap reaching toward the camera with the fearless curiosity that had become his defining characteristic. Beside them stood Colt, one hand resting protectively on Josie's shoulder, the other holding the lead rope of the chestnut mare, whose presence had somehow become essential to all their important family moments. The mare herself grazed peacefully. In the paddock visible through the window, her coat now gleaming with health, and her movements fluid with the confidence of an animal who knew herself to be valued and loved. She was no longer the broken creature who'd limped into that auction ring, just as Josie was no longer the desperate widow who'd spent her last $5 on an act of mercy that had seemed foolish to everyone watching. She's going to fall. Next month, Colt said, coming up behind Josie as she stood at the window watching the mare. Doc Patterson thinks it'll be an easy birth. She's mature, healthy, and she's settled into a routine here. New life, Josie murmured, leaning back against his chest as his arms came around her. It seems fitting somehow. The mare who brought us together, giving birth to the future. James gurgled from his place on the blanket spread before the fireplace, his chubby hands reaching for dust motes that danced in the afternoon sunlight. At 8 months old, he was a sturdy child with his mother's thoughtful eyes and his father's stubborn chin, though which father had contributed that particular trait was something they'd long since stopped worrying about. Thomas had given James life, but Colt was giving him everything else: patience, protection, and the kind of quiet strength that came from a man who'd learned the difference between what money could buy and what it couldn't. Mrs. Henderson stopped by this morning while you were in town, Josie said. She brought news from Copper Ridge. Good news, I hope. Hiram Dalton was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. The federal judge said his crimes were particularly heinous because they targeted vulnerable people who couldn't defend themselves. Justice then, finally. Justice and something else. Mrs. Henderson said the town council voted to establish a fund for widows and families in crisis. They're calling it the Mercy Fund, and they want me to serve on the board of directors. Colt was quiet for a moment, understanding the significance of the invitation. For Copper Ridge to ask Josie to help oversee charitable activities meant they'd come to see her not as the desperate woman who'd needed their pity, but as someone whose judgment and compassion were worth respecting. Will you accept? I think so. It feels like a way to honor what happened, to make sure that other people in desperate circumstances don't have to face what I faced. Thomas would be proud, Colt said quietly, of who you've become, of how you've raised his son, of the life you've built despite everything that tried to stop you. It was the first time in months that either of them had spoken Thomas's name aloud, and Josie felt a familiar tightness in her chest, not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but the gentler ache of love, remembered and honored. She'd learned that it was possible to carry the past with gratitude while still embracing the present with hope. I've been thinking about something, she said, about the cabin where James was born. What about it? I want to buy it from the territorial government. Not to live in this is our home now, but to preserve it. Maybe turn it into a place where women in difficult circumstances can stay temporarily while they get back on their feet. A safe house. A place where people can remember that broken things can be mended, that desperate situations don't have to be permanent. She turned in his arms to face him. We could afford it now, couldn't we? With the compensation money and our resources? We could afford anything you want, within reason. But are you sure? Going back there, dealing with all those memories? I'm sure. That cabin is where I learned that mercy matters more than money, where I discovered that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, where my son was born in the middle of a storm and survived to see the sunrise. Those are good memories, Colt. They deserve to be honored. James chose that moment to roll over on his blanket and push himself up on his hands and knees, rocking back and forth with the determination of a child who was contemplating his first serious attempt at crawling. Both parents turned their attention to him, watching with the fascination that even the most mundane baby milestones could inspire in people who understood how precious and fragile new life could be. "He's going to be mobile soon," Colt observed with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Which means we need to make sure the house is ready for a curious baby who doesn't understand the concept of danger, or property rights, or personal boundaries, or the difference between food and everything else in the world." They laughed together, the easy laughter of people who'd learned to find joy in simple moments, who understood that happiness wasn't something you achieved once and kept forever, but something you created new each day through small acts of love and attention. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window, where they could see Margaret Whitmore returning from her weekly trip to town, her saddlebags bulging with supplies and correspondence. At 72, she still insisted on making the journey herself, claiming that the exercise kept her young and the independence kept her sane. "Any word from the territorial capital?" Colt asked as his aunt entered the house, stamping mud off her boots with characteristic vigor. "Indeed, there is. Governor Morrison has accepted your proposal for the land conservation program. Starting next spring, the territory will begin setting aside grazing land for sustainable cattle management, with the Brenner Ranch serving as the pilot program. It was a project Colt had been working on for months, a way to use his family's wealth and influence to promote responsible land use. It would benefit both ranchers and the environment. The old Colt might have simply donated money to environmental causes and considered his responsibility fulfilled. The new Colt, shaped by love and loss and the understanding that real change required personal involvement, was determined to be more directly engaged in making the world better. "There's more," Margaret continued, settling into her favorite chair with the satisfaction of someone delivering particularly good news. "The territorial legislature has passed the Women's Property Rights Act. Married women will now be able to own property in their own names, and widows will have stronger legal protections against exploitation." "The Dalton Prevention Act," Josie said with grim satisfaction. "It's about time. The legislative committee specifically cited your case as an example of why the law was needed. Your name is actually mentioned in the legislative record as someone whose courage in the face of intimidation helped expose a systematic pattern of abuse." It was strange to think that her desperate fight to keep her small cabin might have helped protect other women from similar exploitation. But then, mercy had a way of spreading in directions you never expected, creating ripples that reached far beyond the original act of kindness. James had finally achieved his goal of forward motion, crawling with unsteady determination toward the fireplace where the warm stones provided an irresistible target for exploration. Both parents moved simultaneously to redirect his attention towards safer pursuits, their coordination speaking of the partnership they'd built through patience and practice. "He's going to be a handful," Margaret observed with obvious delight. "Intelligent, determined, and completely fearless. Rather like his mother, rather like his whole family," Colt corrected. "The Brenners have never been known for taking the easy path." As the afternoon deepened into evening, they settled into the comfortable routine that had become their family's rhythm. Colt read aloud from the weekly newspaper while Josie worked on embroidery. James played with wooden toys carved by his stepfather's patient hands, and Margaret dozed in her chair with the contentment of someone who'd lived long enough to see impossible dreams become everyday reality. The mare whinnied softly from her paddock, and through the window they could see her standing at the fence as if keeping watch over the house and its inhabitants. She'd become more than just a horse to them. She was a living reminder of the moment when mercy had triumphed over logic, when 5 crumpled dollars had purchased not just a broken animal, but the beginning of a new kind of family. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bid on her that day?" Colt asked. "Every day," Josie replied, "but not with regret. Just with gratitude that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that seem completely foolish. At the time, $5 and a chance. $5 and a lifetime." As darkness fell over the ranch, and the family prepared for the comfortable rituals of evening James's bath and bedtime story, the final check on the horses, the quiet conversation by the fire that had become their way of ending each day, Josie found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. It hadn't been easy path. Trust, once broken, had required patient rebuilding. Grief, once acknowledged, had demanded its own time and space to heal. Love, once recognized, had needed room to grow without pressure or expectations that might have crushed it before it could fully bloom. But they'd done the work, day by day and choice by choice, until what had begun as desperation and deception had transformed into something real and lasting. They'd learned that mercy was stronger than justice, that forgiveness was more powerful than revenge, and that sometimes the most broken things could become the most beautiful when given enough time and care to heal. The portrait on the mantelpiece captured a single moment, but it represented so much more: the triumph of hope over despair, the victory of love over loneliness, and the simple truth that $5 spent on mercy could change the course of 3 lives and ripple outward to touch a world that desperately needed reminding that kindness mattered more than profit. The mare nickered once more from her paddock, a sound that seemed to carry both blessing and promise across the peaceful darkness. And in the warm light of the ranch house, a family settled into sleep with the confidence that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for grace, new chances to choose love over fear, and new reasons to believe that broken things could indeed be made whole again.